Thank you for the invitation to be a part of this virtual Amsterdam Tribal Art Fair and to share some of my thoughts about the background to my book, Adorned by Nature, which to me has been a fantastic celebration of the amazing adornments and artifacts that the islanders of the South Seas have produced. But let's get right into thinking about some of the background that led to this book. My journey to the Adorned by Nature book was primarily started 30 years ago by a business career in IBM and subsequently my own consulting firm, where I talked globally to people about the future of technology, the future of business. But the most important thing, it allowed me to indulge in my favorite hobby throughout my life, and that is the ocean. And that really started when I was a young boy and my parents moved to South Africa. I saw the sea for the first time. I could walk out onto the shore and find cowrie shells littering the beach every morning. It was absolutely amazing. My father then bought me a diving mask, and I was able to put my head into rock pools and see these seashells alive and the environment that they lived in. And it enabled me to really follow this throughout my whole life. Wherever I went on a business trip, I would also take the time to do some diving and photograph some really amazing underwater scenes. And one thing that I realized in diving all over the world was really that 90% of the animals that have been alive on this planet are actually only preserved as fossils. And so a lot of the marine life also can be seen in the fossil record. And that's where my interest in fossils came from, and developed a whole bunch of new relationships and friends, and including this man, David Attenborough, who became a close friend, and of course also has one of the biggest and best tribal art collections in the world. All of this led to me documenting my collections of fossils and so on in 3 books. And this trilogy, the Deep Time Trilogy, won the award for Best Nonfiction Book Series just 2 years ago. Very proud of that. And the research for these books had taken me to some of the most beautiful islands in the South Seas. And I don't know if you know this, but this area we're talking about is actually got the world's most diverse marine environments. And the area just west of New Guinea, the Raja Ampat area of Western Papua, has really got the most intense and diverse marine life on the planet. The shells and corals that arise there are quite unique in the world. you probably can understand that even divers have to come to land sometimes. The people we met were always generous in terms of sharing their food, their culture, and they took us to places which were quite unimaginable. And my interest in collecting tribal adornments was really triggered by a collection of what was called curious money that was sold at an auction in the UK. The person who had this collection basically collected at the end of the Second World War, as soldiers were returning from the Pacific. He would meet them at train stations in London and offer to exchange what they brought with them for money, which they all needed. And so he amassed a collection of items which are almost unimaginable. And he, in fact, labeled them beautifully, as this example shows. And you can imagine that this core of a collection came my way, that it didn't end there. As an addicted collector, it soon increased. And it began to appear everywhere in our home, and shelves and walls were filled with them. It became something that surrounded us all the time. Some of the items were cheap and new, others were old and historic. And as my knowledge increased, so my interest increased as well. You can imagine that this collection was really like a classroom that enabled me to learn, well, almost every day. And then after 20 years of doing this, suddenly something crystallized, and it was really what became the theme of the Adorned by Nature book. It's strange how it didn't dawn on me earlier, that here you have these islanders who have no access to metals or to precious stones. They began crafting unbelievably beautiful adornments, but from all the natural materials that they had. And as I developed the text for the book, I realized that these objects all had different purposes. They weren't just adornments. And around the trading of these items, they developed networks that grew from the original traders from the Arab countries and from China and so on, into the most sophisticated trading networks. And trading networks not based on profit, but based on building relationships that would survive for generations. And this is the story of the book. And unashamedly, I must say, this is a very personal perspective. The content of the book, it has an introduction on the South Seas, the people, the myths and so on. And what we've been able to do with some of the latest technology is to colorize some of the photographs and to zoom into them like the original photographers were absolutely unable to do. Perhaps not surprisingly, a key chapter in here is on the shells, the feathers, and all the raw materials, the natural raw materials that the local population used to make these adornments. Now, again, it's a little bit more than just they used shells or pearl shells. There's a little bit of a history why they're different, where they came from, and so on. And nautilus shells especially, I noticed a lot of the documentation that was written in the last 100 years had misinterpreted this as being pearl shell. The raw material that was used to make these precious objects is explained in quite a lot of detail. The objects themselves, of course, you're all familiar with, and they are both beautiful and beautifully made. And some, like the Solomon Islands shell money, were developed into the most incredibly small discs. And it's difficult to understand how these could have been made without any metal tools and turned into objects not just of currency, but also of adornment, were so precious that they eventually became heirlooms. And finally, the networks that connected all these cultures are described in summary, really. Some of the highlands networks like the Mocha and the Te, the Hiwi trading networks in the Papuan Gulf, and around the Santa Cruz Islands, where the fabulous feather money, of course, was was used as a basis for currency and trade. And then, of course, my favorite of all of them, the cooler ring. I was incredibly lucky to obtain the photographs from Jutta Malnik, who'd done a lot of photography in the area of the cooler ring in the 1970s, just before she died last year. And they're featured quite extensively in the beautiful representation of the Masim culture that I've ever seen. Finally, there was also one last point, perhaps, that I'd like to mention, and that is that all these objects of adornment have other purposes, depending on who's using them and when. So some shell beads could be made as a currency, then integrated into a bride price, or worn as a prestige item, and eventually end up as an heirloom or be used in some ceremonies. So the value of the object changes and morphs as it moves through the culture. And each of these has a material, social, and a spiritual dimension, which makes the individual cultures and myths that surround them so exciting and so different to anything that we're used to in our somewhat boring lives. And finally, when these objects end up in a collection or in a museum, then a whole new and different value perception comes into play. As part of this project, what we've also wanted to do was to give something back, and this is what we're doing. We're giving 100 copies of the book to community and arts projects around the South Seas and encourage them to use the books as an inspiration to develop what can only be called now transitional objects. And we're focused on those areas, but it will be very interesting to see what the output of these projects will be. The first of those have gone off to Papua New Guinea. We're starting a project in the northern part of Malaita in the Solomon Islands. And we are encouraging people to document what they do on their mobile phones. And of course, one of the possibilities is that we use this for volume 2 of the book. Thank you very much for listening. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the Amsterdam Tribal Art Fair.